Order, order. Welcome to today's meeting of the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy. We're holding an evidence session on Pillar 2 of the UK's National Security Strategy, focusing on the UK's strength abroad, and in particular today focusing on the nuclear deterrent, nuclear proliferation and technology cooperation. We have two panels. The first with Ambassador Rose Gottemoeller and Dr. Marian Messmer. Could I first ask our two witnesses to introduce themselves, and then we'll come to questions, perhaps starting with you, Ambassador.
Yes, thank you very much, and I am greatly honored to appear before this committee today. My name is Rose Gottemoeller. I'm the William J. Perry Lecturer at Stanford University and also a research fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. Prior to this position at Stanford, I was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO in Brussels, and prior to that time, I was the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, with responsibility for arms control, nonproliferation, and political military affairs. Also, during my time in the State Department working for President Obama, I was the chief U.S. negotiator of the New START treaty with the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, those credentials speak for themselves. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Messmer.
Thank you very much, and I'd also like to start by thanking the committee for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm a senior research fellow in the International Security Program at Chatham House, where my research looks at modern deterrence questions. That includes conventional as well as nuclear deterrence, and I'm increasingly interested in how especially European states can make the most out of their capability investments to strengthen deterrence overall. And prior to joining Chatham House, I was co-director of BASIC, where I was working on nuclear risk reduction and disarmament questions. And prior to that, I wrote a PhD on NATO-Russia cooperation at King's College London. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you're both very welcome, and thank you both for your time today. We have about 40 minutes for this session because of votes. We hope we won't be interrupted, but can I therefore encourage both committee members and those responding to keep your questions and answers fairly brisk, and of course the witnesses can of course follow up in writing should you wish to develop any points further or provide any further evidence. Perhaps I can start. I'm going to put this question to you both, but perhaps starting with you, Ambassador Gottemoeller. The UK's National Security Strategy describes nuclear weapons as having increasing salience within the policies, doctrines and approaches of adversaries. It also warns, the Strategic Defence Review also warns of a new and more complex set of pathways to escalation. Perhaps you could just reflect for us on how that affects the security threats and what those kind of pathways might look like. What is nuclear doctrine in this more complex age? Ambassador Gottemoeller, to start, please.
Yes, perhaps I will start indeed with the strategy and note that in addition, it says that the foundations of strategic stability are being challenged and more states will have more nuclear weapons, expecting further proliferation of nuclear and disruptive technology, along with failure of international arms control agreements. I do believe that, in fact, we are at a time where we need to be thinking ahead and thinking hard about the role of further control of nuclear weapons, whether it's in the non-proliferation treaty regime or in arms control negotiations and the possibility of further arms control agreements with both the Russian Federation and China, because China is rapidly modernizing now, building up its nuclear forces in a way that we did not expect to see only a decade ago. And so, honestly, it's a whole new era in terms of the geopolitics of the situation, with China becoming, as the United States considers it, potentially a second nuclear peer. But we also have the issue of further proliferation among states, further states acquiring nuclear weapons, including so-called friendly proliferation among allies of the United States who may feel that they should be considering the acquisition of nuclear weapons to bolster their own security and stability. So these are all difficult and dangerous trends for preventing the further spread of nuclear weapons and the further, as you put it, Chairman, the further emphasis on nuclear weapons. The security strategy pushes in that direction, but it also points out the wide array of conventional threats that we will be facing. And so we have to make some tough decisions about whether we try to continue to control the nuclear bomb or let it run free.
And thank you. And could you just say something about those other pathways to escalation, the interaction between the nuclear and conventional and indeed modern unconventional weaponry?
Yes, well, I have been concerned that some of the new technologies that are emerging, particularly the enhanced sensing capabilities that will emerge in the next 2 decades with the advent of quantum sensing, as well as the ability to further develop the means to analyze massive amounts of information flowing off sensing systems, will actually begin to pose a threat to mobile nuclear systems that have been at the heart of our nuclear retaliatory forces, our insurance policy. To be honest, Chairman, I do not believe that we are facing anytime soon the vulnerability of submarine-based nuclear deterrence. But for those countries that deploy mobile ICBMs, for example, I think that there will be enhanced sensing capabilities and the ability to rapidly, even mobile targets, the ability to rapidly track and trace them. So these are big problems out there. Again, it's not for tomorrow, but it is within the next 2 to 3 decades, I believe.
Thank you very much. Dr. Messmer, same points to you, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just to add to what Rose Gottemoeller just said, I would look at the threat development in short, medium, and long term. And in the short term, I think the biggest challenge for the United Kingdom and other European allies and partners is that the risk from Russia has increased significantly, while, of course, as the National Security Strategy points out, capabilities have not necessarily kept up with that. And so one of the biggest challenges for policymakers, it seems to me, is essentially this tension between needing to make the right investments at the right time. And so I think what we can see from how Russian policy seems to have adjusted and from the signaling that we see from Russian government is that there are certain conventional investments that Russia is in fact paying very close attention to, such as long-range precision strike systems. And so in my mind, for the medium and longer term, what we are going to see is essentially perhaps asymmetric opportunities both to strengthen deterrence and to engage in future arms control. I think arms control opportunities are likely going to be more in the medium to long term. I think especially when we look at the relationship with Russia, we would need to see a significant change in the current government in order to be able to engage, or at the very least a significant change in Russia's security posture. And until we are at that point, I don't necessarily see us being able to get to any new arms control agreements. But I think with regards to strengthening deterrence, there are shorter term steps that European states are already taking and can continue to take that will hopefully get us to some sort of new strategic stability arrangement in the European continent. And in terms of other nuclear threats that I would also highlight, I think we are essentially looking at a much more complex web of nuclear relationships. One of the things that I have found really interesting recently is the new defense arrangement between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia that allegedly also has a nuclear extended deterrence component to it. And that means if we are looking at Southern Asia, we're now looking at essentially a nuclear standoff between India, Pakistan, China, and potentially also then extending to Saudi Arabia. And I think what we can take from that is essentially that even though in Europe we are very much focused on Russia in the short to medium term and perhaps on China in the longer term, there are other nuclear armed states globally that we probably can't ignore when it comes to the threat that they pose, in huge part because even if the United Kingdom wasn't directly involved in a nuclear escalation between India and Pakistan, if it was to come to nuclear war in that region, the impact of that would be felt globally. And so in that sense, we're essentially looking at a very complex web of relationships, and there are some really important choices that the UK needs to make for its own security, but at the same time it shouldn't neglect other relationships with states where it could influence other security dilemmas.
Thank you very much. Really helpful. Lord Roble.
Yeah, leading on from that directly, really, I'm old enough to have grown up with mutually assured destruction. One or two other people may remember that, and it seemed quite nice and calm. Now we're talking about the possibility of tactical nuclear weapons being used by Russia against Ukraine. Whether or not there's any truth to that, I have no idea. And we've heard about difficult and dangerous trends and further controls being needed. Well, the question is that as things have changed and taboos have changed, does lower level aggression with nuclear weapons seem more or less likely?
Ambassador Dr. Muller?
If I may, Chairman, perhaps I'll begin, and I'm very interested to hear what Dr. Mesmer has to say as well. The member, I believe, is referring to the crisis that we truly faced in the autumn of 2022, when it seemed possible that the Russian Federation would use nuclear weapons. I know that U.S. intelligence, at least in terms of news reports, media reports I have seen, thought that there was a 50-50 chance that nuclear weapons might be used in Ukraine by Russia as a tactical mechanism, a tactical tool to try to halt the advance of the Ukrainian army when they had the Russian army on the run. Now, again, according to reports, evidently the military in the Russian Federation were able to convince the political leadership that this was not a good idea. And I wanted to use this opportunity to point again to the reasons why we moved away from nuclear warfighting in the 1960s and 70s. And that is because nuclear weapons create not only immediate damage, but they also create radiation contamination and difficulties for troops to operate. And so from an operational perspective, they are simply not a practical warfighting tool, and they produce long-term damage in terms of the kind of radiation contamination that occurs. And so I do believe when I've read reports that the message to the Kremlin was simply, this is not going to buy the advantage hoped for, and furthermore, that it will break this long-standing taboo and really place Russia, as it already these days is very much a pariah state, but truly make it a global pariah state with states across the Southern Hemisphere that have been very, very committed to maintaining and sustaining nuclear-free zones in the Southern Hemisphere, finally turning against Moscow. So I think that there are a number of considerations that come into play. It's not only related to the threat to the nuclear taboo rightly pointed to, but also the fact that we learned these lessons hard in the 60s and 70s and so have backed away from these kinds of investments and kinds of plans and views of useful tactics. They simply do not buy advantage on the battlefield.
Thank you. Dr. Mesmer?
I would agree with that assessment. I think, tactical nuclear weapons have captured the imagination because they are something that Russia has, and frankly, the United Kingdom does not. But I agree essentially that it's very difficult to think of a way of actually using them in a conflict situation, and I worry that this is perhaps a bit of a legacy of Russian thinking that stems from a time when Russian conventional forces were in much poorer state than they are now, when there was a concern that Russia would be much quicker to go to tactical nuclear weapons simply because they did not have any other options.
Thank you. Baroness Gidron.
Thank you, Chair. Ambassador, you started to talk a bit about sensing systems, quantum, and what you felt was coming up in the next 2 to 3 decades. So I'm just curious for you to sort of build on that a bit and talk about the risks around emerging technologies undermining the nuclear capability, and really what steps you think that we need to be thinking about to mitigate those risks in the earlier part of that 2 to 3 decades. And then I was hoping that you would speak a little bit more broadly about the sort of democratization of access to dangerous capabilities that might manifest in other ways.
Very good, ma'am, and thank you for your question. It's a complicated issue and one that I've been thinking about quite a bit. I talked about the potential threat that could emerge to the reliability of second strike deterrence, but I also, and many people are concerned about the possibility of meddling in nuclear command and control that could occur because of the artificial intelligence tools that may emerge. This is one of those Hollywood kinds of scenarios that people have been wrestling with quite a bit. But I do think it makes sense to wrestle with the issue, to focus on it, and to have leaders focus on it. I was glad when President Joe Biden got Xi Jinping, the president of China, to agree that there should always be a person in the loop for nuclear command and control. These are the kinds of steps that I think nations need to be taking and need to build on, and the kinds of steps that we need to have robust strategic stability discussions about. I note that in the so-called P5 process, which involves also the UK and France, as well as Russia and China, and the United States, the nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there were efforts in the past year to focus on these very future-oriented issues and to try to get states to recognize the threat coming at us and to think ahead about the normative superstructure we need to put in place. And then potentially over time, I wouldn't exclude the notion of some kind of negotiated measures that would have more technical aspects to them. That is, verification and monitoring of those kinds of limitations or controls. And so I do think we need to be creative. It's very difficult to imagine these days those kinds of technical controls, but I think we need to work hard to figure out what's in our best interest, honestly. Is it to, again, let these developments run free, or try to think about ways to steer them, or as we sometimes say, place guardrails around them? So that would be my focus in terms of weapons of mass destruction. You asked me to comment on other possible areas where threats may be emerging linked to new technologies. And let me take this opportunity to say, as far as weapons of mass destruction are concerned, my view is in future that the biggest boost to new technology in these arenas will be in the biological and chemical arenas, so-called new biotech. And there's a crossover between biology and chemistry when we think about the future of these fields. And I do think that the potential for malign actors in these areas is great. And I was glad to see that the National Security Strategy mentioned biology and chemistry as areas where new weapons of mass destruction developments may occur. I will just use this opportunity to say also, I would have liked to have seen a little more attention to the potential for new controls on nuclear weapons, but the strategy was silent on that question.
Okay, thank you very much. May I ask the same question?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
I agree with everything that was said, and would just add that I think another very likely challenge from AI that we're already seeing is essentially an influenced or poisoned information environment that makes it much harder to assess what is really happening and to draw the right conclusions from it. And that affects decision makers just as much as the general public. The National Security Strategy talks quite a lot about resilience and population resilience. And I think this is one of the areas where urgent action is needed, just because if the information environment is poisoned in a democracy, then that leads to really severe consequences. And it also makes it that much harder for political leaders to make the right decisions. In terms of the democratization of access, the National Security Strategy rightly points out that there might be a growing threat from non-state actors as well as from state actors. And I think we are seeing some of these trends already. One of the technologies that I think has become vastly easier to procure is missile technology. That's of course not necessarily weapons of mass destruction related, but I think this is one of those technologies where we can see how conflict is changing and how new actors can can now use almost the same technology as state actors. And the other, of course, is drone technology, where you can see that even with commercially accessible drones, it is very easy for a range of actors to put together quite sophisticated attacks. And so essentially drawing the bridge on what could be done to remedy that, we know that the UK and wider Europe does not have enough traditional missile defense technology or drone defense technologies. And so I think this is something where we essentially need both national thinking and joint-up thinking across Europe to remedy some of that.
And just on your point about the poisoned information system, where do you see that conversation happening, and where do you see a mitigation against that possibility happening? In what arena?
It's a really big conversation, and I think there would need to be various layers to that. I think there needs to be greater awareness in the public that this is a threat to begin with, but you would need to target quite specific interventions at different groups of people. I think there is really something to be done about elite levels at different levels, whether that's CEOs of private companies or university professors or indeed parliamentarians, just because those are people that make quite important decisions and need to be able to assess information accurately. But at the same time, we also need to look at how journalists, for example, are consuming information, where evidence is coming from, and I think an element of that would also need to be greater regulation of social media channels, and needing to make sure that there is a clear, trusted pipeline of information that's accessible, or at the very least that everyone in society is much more critical about the information that they are consuming and much better able to verify whether something is accurate or not.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lord Watts.
Can I ask you, what are the long-term risks to the credibility of the nuclear deterrent? Can I also ask whether you have a view about whether it's feasible for the dreadnought subs to come on into service by 2030? And how could we strengthen NATO's deterrence? And that's 3 questions in one, but because of the time I've put them that way.
Okay, I can go ahead and start with that. I think some of the long-term challenges to the credibility of the nuclear deterrent essentially have a lot to do with perception. I mean, of course, the actual capabilities are really important, but when I was thinking about that question, I was thinking about a range of different impacts. So on the one hand, the impact of the failed Trident test in February 2024, and then, of course, the impact of the Vanguard submarines being longer at sea and also returning to port with visible damage to them, or needing to be serviced more frequently. Then, of course, what we know about the dreadnought replacement program and the warhead replacement program, but also I think really importantly, whenever we talk about deterrence, how it is perceived by potential adversaries is so important. And so something that I also find interesting in that regard is how in the Russian public, the UK and NATO and France and essentially various aspects of deterrence capabilities are spoken about. And so I think if we assess all of these aspects separately, we know that Russia really cares about the fact that UK nuclear weapons are dedicated to NATO and are part of NATO's extended deterrence capability. That's something that they see as something that they need to pay attention to. And we've seen that as France has sort of thought about what role its nuclear weapons play for European deterrence, that the Russian media conversation about France has shifted significantly. So I think, if we're sort of weighing up pros and cons, then that's essentially a plus in terms of the long-term deterrence capabilities. But if we look at the failed Trident test in February 2024, then I'm afraid that essentially would be seen as a weakness. Even though the US has, of course, conducted lots of successful tests, if you just look at the UK tests, then that track record is a lot less strong. And I think that can't be explained away simply by saying that the missiles are part of the same pool, because deterrence has so much to do with perception as well. I think similarly with the Vanguard submarines staying at sea longer and returning, with barnacles on them or whatever it might be. I think that's also something that in the perception of nuclear deterrence would not necessarily show a strength. So, what does that mean for the UK? I think it essentially means that as the UK is thinking about how to invest in various deterrence capabilities, messaging is a really big part of it, and essentially showing that NATO and showing that joint up European deterrence thinking is at the forefront of UK thought is going to be really important. But also it is really important that the Dreadnought replacement program works well, and that the submarines can be delivered as close to schedule as possible. Now, as far as I know, they are still on schedule, but if we look at the sort of history of large-scale defence industrial projects in the UK, they often aren't delivered on time, and schedule overruns are quite common. So given that that the delivery deadline is still a little while away, I wonder whether we're going to be able to deliver on time, and given that we know that shipyards are facing challenges, I think this is one of those things where the earlier investments can take place, the better. And then finally, just to come to the last aspect of your question, I think that there's a really interesting intersection here between industrial policy, sort of skills policy, and investment. And one of the things that really struck me when I looked at the national security strategy was that it points out that it wants the UK to be a leader in all sorts of technologies and all sorts of capabilities. But if we look at, for example, the extent to which the university sector in the UK is struggling at the moment, that's of course a crucial part of being able to deliver on those various aspects, because that's where a lot of the skilled workforce is going to come from when it comes to engineers, when it comes to investment in new startups and so on. And so I think one of the big challenges the UK faces is essentially that lots of these challenges are incredibly integrated, and you can't necessarily solve them just by investing in one aspect of it, and a much more holistic approach is needed.
Rose?
Ambassador?
Yes, thank you very much. That was a comprehensive answer, and if I may, I will depend on it for my own response about the state of the UK programs, because I'm much less up to date on them than I am about the US triad modernization, which is also under pressure. We are hoping to see the first of the Ohio-class replacements by mid-2035, but it is under pressure, and there's no question about it. The investments have to be there, and indeed the workforce have to be there. I wanted to reflect a bit more on the extended nuclear deterrent and what has been done, since the national security strategy rightly points out that transactionalism is due to increase, and states are relying more on kind of pragmatic deals rather than of necessity extending their guarantees and extending their policy. Dr. Mesmer is quite right that the reliability of extended nuclear deterrent guarantees are a matter of perception. And so I think it's very important to think in this era of greater transactionalism, how to ensure the reliability of the extended nuclear deterrent in Europe. And I applaud the UK and France for various steps that have been taken together. And the strategy makes note of the fact that the Lancaster House agreements are being bolstered in preparation for a UK-France summit meeting coming up in 2025. And I know that the Lancaster House agreements have served the nuclear programs of both countries well. And I think that is an aspect that will continue to bolster the reliability of the nuclear deterrent. I would like to say that it is a moment when the extended nuclear deterrent capabilities deployed in Europe are at top condition. The United States completed the modernization of the so-called B-61-12 warhead. All of those warheads are now deployed in Europe. The storage facilities and handling facilities have been upgraded at considerable cost, and all of the NATO allies who are basing states have agreed to purchase the F-35, and some of them, for example, in the Netherlands, have already been certified for the so-called dual capable mission. So I do think that it's important that NATO continue to project as one the reliability of the nuclear deterrent. And I am glad that the exercise Steadfast Noon took place last week. Very important, again, to color the view that the nuclear deterrent in Europe is alive and well, and that extended nuclear deterrence continues to be viable and strong. But there's no question with this greater transactionalism in the alliance that it will be important for the UK and France, as the other nuclear weapon states in the NATO alliance, to continue to strengthen their roles. And I've been glad that the UK has been willing to do so along with France in the last year.
Can I just ask?
Yeah, please.
Can you just clarify how independent the systems are? Because they seem to be somewhat reliant on American cooperation.
As far as the French nuclear deterrent, of course, they have always said that it is for the defense of France. President Macron recently has been talking more about extending nuclear deterrence guarantees to NATO allies, including to Germany. The UK, of course, sustains its independent command and control decision-making, nuclear use decisions belonging, of course, very much to the Prime Minister. And of course, the United States of America, the final nuclear use decision belongs to the President of the United States. The U.S. declaratory doctrine under this administration has been, as far as we know, as follows. Mr. Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, stated in February that the European allies would be responsible for conventional defense in Europe, and the United States would remain responsible for the extended nuclear deterrent and for decisions that would have to be made in that regard. And so I think we must rely on that statement. And I really think that, as I said, the alliance is showing very well in the way it's training, exercising, and deploying nuclear weapons that there is a capability and capacity available. But indeed, it's up to decision-making in individual capitals of the nuclear weapon states in the alliance as to how and when nuclear weapons would actually be employed.
Lord Tunnicliffe, can I just ask both witnesses, please? We are quite short of time. If you can keep your answers quite brisk, please, that would be very kind. Thank you.
The UK independent deterrent is stuck on the top of an American missile. Can we have confidence that the lease program will continue indefinitely?
I can go first on that, if I may.
Please, Dr. Messier.
So this agreement is essentially protected through the UK-US a defense agreement, which is one of the longest standing nuclear cooperation treaties, certainly between UK and US, but also globally. And that treaty was strengthened in November or December of 2024, so just towards the end of President Biden's term in office. So it's my understanding that, at least from a legal perspective, it's a difficult agreement to get out of. But you are right that the threat to the continuity of the UK's nuclear deterrence capability is, of course, the servicing of the Trident missiles. So if they couldn't be serviced in the long term, the UK would not be able to field Trident missiles.
Ambassador, anything to add?
I will just say that as part of the triad modernization in the United States, all due attention is being given to the modernization of the Trident missiles. I personally feel confident that not only are the missiles in a modernization process that will continue, but also that the US-UK nuclear cooperation agreement and the agreement with regard to the Trident missiles will remain and continue as it has now for many, many decades. I will also mention the advent of the so-called AUKUS program that I think it's perhaps not apropos to this discussion today, but nevertheless, it is noted as being part of the outreach of the UK to other parts and regions of the world where there are important alliance relationships. And I believe that the AUKUS program and the submarine construction program that goes with it actually bolsters the overall cooperation between the UK and the United States.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move us on.
Yeah,
Lord Broworth.
You've answered these questions to a certain extent already. In particular, you've answered, Ambassador, you've talked about the commitment of the UK and indeed the Western Alliance to nuclear weapons. And what I'm really interested in is proliferation, which you also mentioned, Ambassador, small countries getting nuclear weapons. When I say small countries, other countries getting nuclear weapons, which we'd probably rather not have. So, first of all, could I ask both of you what the potential consequences of UK security would be if international constraints fail, what we've been talking about, and there's proliferation, and particularly, could you look at the insecurity that would drive UK allies, as you talked about, Ambassador, to start developing their own nuclear weapons? And what more could the UK do? I think probably the UK in alliance with America and possibly France to reassure allies that such proliferation is unnecessary.
Absolutely, sir. I would say that, well, let me refer to a bipartisan task force that I recently served on, chaired by Tino Cuellar, Ernest Moniz, and Megan O'Sullivan from respectively the Carnegie Endowment, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and Harvard University's Belfer Center. I was on this task force, and we came up with a report that is called Preventing an Era of Nuclear Anarchy. Nuclear proliferation and American security. But nuclear anarchy, in my view, would apply to global states worldwide and certainly to US friends and allies. And so I would underscore the main message of that report, and that is that we should be looking for ways to reassure our allies and partners so that friendly proliferation, as it's come to be known, does not become a trend. And I think that that is a message, to be honest with you, that I would have liked to have seen in the national security strategy, the UK national security strategy. It was not present. There was mention of the advent of further nuclear proliferation, but no mention of the necessity, for example, of bolstering the non-proliferation treaty regime, of looking for other ways to strengthen the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency, especially as we move into an era of enhanced attention to nuclear energy and innovation in the area of nuclear energy. These, of course, are important trends to have further access to electricity generation from nuclear power, but we also have to ensure that the new reactors are proliferation resistant. And so I do think that we are not hopeless or helpless in this regard, but we do need to pay attention. And the reassurance that the US, UK, and France can provide to the other allies is, I would say, the first order of business, but also strengthening and bolstering the non-proliferation regime. Those are other steps that we should be paying attention to.
US extended deterrence has played a really significant role previously in ensuring that other European states did not want to develop nuclear weapons. And given that we've seen the UK decision to join the dual capable aircraft program, I think if there was a serious threat that currently non-nuclear weapon states within NATO are considering developing nuclear weapons, figuring out whether extending the DCA program to them could be one easy step to take that could hopefully discourage them from proliferating. In addition to that, I think if there is any risk, and acknowledging that Ambassador Gottemoeller pointed out the extent to which we can currently rely on US extended deterrence in Europe, but if there's any further concern that this might not remain as stable in the future, then the UK and France could present some more serious options as to what they can do together in order to provide extended deterrence for NATO.
Thank you. Sir Gavin.
I think actually Andrew covered my question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Lord Hutton.
Can we turn our attention now to the future of collective security in Europe and the balance between nuclear and conventional forces? How would you rate the UK's efforts to reduce the need for nuclear responses by boosting conventional military capabilities through, for example, deeper collaboration with the European Union? Is this a sensible thing for us to be doing?
Perhaps I will start. I believe, and this has actually been a long-term trend, and I should have noted earlier that as far as NATO policy is concerned, NATO believes that the potential to use nuclear weapons is extremely remote and would only come about as a result of a nuclear attack on a NATO target. And so I think we need to keep it that way. The potential that nuclear weapons would be used would be an enormous catastrophe. And we need to ensure that it remains extremely remote. And we do that by bolstering and strengthening conventional capabilities and capacities throughout the NATO alliance. And frankly, I do welcome the cooperation that the UK has underlined with the European Union, because I think it can do a lot to address the issues that we have seen in the defense industrial base as we've been trying to assist Ukraine throughout these 3 years of war. That the defense industrial base throughout Europe, UK being among the strongest, of course, but it needs modernization, it needs upgrading, it needs attention to technology and innovation, and it also needs the ability to handle serial production in a way that may be needed and will be needed should Russia continue in its aggression. And so I applaud the notion of deeper cooperation between the UK and the European Union. I think it can be very valuable.
Thank you. Dr. Mesmer?
I would agree to that. And I would also say that one of the things that the national security strategy could have done better is focusing much more on conventional deterrence as how to acquire those deterrence capabilities. Because one of the things that concerns me in the UK's approach, and the UK is not alone in that, several other European countries do this as well, is trying to do this dual approach, where on the one hand there's an awareness that stronger conventional deterrence is needed, but on the other hand, any defense procurement is also meant to help with strengthening the economy overall and providing all of these secondary benefits. And we do unfortunately know from military procurement research that the more requirements you have of your procurement, that's not just procuring the capability as such, the greater the risk that the procurement is going to overrun, whether that's in time or cost. And while I completely understand why there's this emphasis on also strengthening the economy and economic performance, I think given the security challenge that we're in, the focus ought to be on procuring the best systems that essentially can handle what we require them to do when it comes to conventional deterrence.
Thank you. Baroness Tyler.
Thank you. Could I just press a little further on this area about deepening collective security in Europe? In your opinion, how realistic would it be for the UK to reduce its strategic dependence on the US, for example, through new nuclear partnerships with France? And my sort of second question is, will the new strategic defence partnership between UK and the EU bring any strategic value the UK does not already receive through its work with NATO? Ambassador, could I ask you first to respond? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Again, I will point to what I see the great advantage of the EU partnership, and that is, again, in this defense industrial base, and also in the modernization of infrastructure that will have to continue to occur. And I know that is very much part of the 5% commitment, 5% of GDP commitment to NATO, the continued modernization of transportation and communications infrastructures. And so I think that it will be vital for the UK and the EU to be working together on that, so as to have a holistic approach to modernization of these infrastructures, road and rail networks, for example, in Europe. So I do think that the partnership will be not only practical, but also vital to the future of defense capacity in Europe for that cooperation to take place. I do not see it, however, as being at the cost of US-UK cooperation by any means. The traditions we just spoke about a moment ago, the long-standing nuclear cooperation and missile cooperation between our two countries. But I like the fact that the national security strategy pointed to the necessity of continuing to build up the cooperation with the United States and to take advantage of the innovation and technology cooperation that may be further strengthened by enhancing that cooperation.
Thank you. Could I just very quickly just press you on that point? Do you feel there's any danger that in the UK trying, if you like, to rebalance its strategic relationship between Europe and the US, that there's a danger of ending up with a sort of a shallow relationship with each, which isn't sort of deep enough in either case?
Yes, I take your point, ma'am. But again, I see this deep legacy of U.S.-UK relations continuing to serve both of our countries well. And then, as far as the EU is concerned, I've welcomed since the exit of the UK from the EU. I've welcomed, and certainly when I was DSG, it was very NATO that UK was working really strongly and intensively with NATO to ensure a strong relationship there. Obviously, we've got parallel members in both NATO and the EU, many of them, and so it seems natural to me that the UK would now redouble its efforts to cooperate with the EU as well on defense matters, particularly, as I said, as we're looking at 5% of GDP, with 1.5% of that being spent on infrastructure improvements that will benefit all of Europe.
Thank you. Dr. Messer, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would agree with what's said. And just to add briefly, I would think of cooperation with France or other European states as adding to the relationship rather than replacing the relationship with the US, in part because it's good for the UK to hedge, and in part because I think we have noted a range of European capabilities that are required regardless of what the United States wants to do. So in addition to nuclear, I would also add space technologies to the table. And again, France would be a great partner for the UK in that regard, as would Germany. And what advantages is the UK getting from working with the EU that it's not getting from NATO? So the EU and NATO, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have come to a fairly good split in terms of their responsibilities, and the EU is focusing a lot on funding various defense projects and funding this expansion of the defense industrial base. And it's really important that the UK work with the EU in that regard so that UK defense industry has access to those same programs. And the EU is also working out how a single market, especially for defense companies, can look like. And again, it's important to ensure that UK companies also have access to that market. So I think when it comes to industrial cooperation, industrial funding, and access to the European single market, those are really important aspects that the UK can primarily get from the European Union rather than from NATO.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There's a very neat segue into our final topic. And Lord Boyton.
Thank you, Chairman. The UK's national security strategy is, to put it kindly, light in terms of its references to Africa. The United States Africa Command is in fact based in Europe, in Stuttgart. The UK and France have certain vital strategic and indeed historical interests on the continent. If you look at the impact of migration, certainly events in Africa impact hugely on the security of our borders in Europe. If you look at vital supply lines in terms of minerals and indeed rare minerals, Africa is of importance. The People's Liberation Army is the fastest growing military presence in Africa. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on how you see Africa in all of this, and where and should the government be prioritising closer cooperation with the EU on defence and security in relation to that continent?
Thank you very much. I can take that first, if that's okay. I think, one of my regrets when looking through the national security strategy was seeing this trade-off that's essentially seen between some of the UK's aid and development investments and the security investments. And I mentioned earlier this framework of looking at short-term, medium and long-term threats. And I think one of the big dangers in the national security strategy is that we are setting ourselves up for future problems at the expense of current problems. And so you mentioned the large Chinese presence across Africa. I think we also shouldn't underestimate the Russian presence in Africa and Russian strategic interest there as well. And my worry is that the UK is one of many European states that's essentially, by and large, withdrawing from working with various African nations and leaving a lot of diplomatic space open to Russia and China. We're already seeing the impact of that at the United Nations and in other multilateral fora. And you mentioned a range of security risks that already exist for us. So while I completely understand the need to prioritize and the fact that there's a limited budget, I do think that this is perhaps not necessarily the best trade-off, simply because it's already evident that there are going to be many, many challenges that are coming at us in the future. So in a report that came out in April this year, I made some recommendations around how European governments could essentially work closer together to leverage together their budgets that will be much greater if they are put together, and to coordinate better what they focus on. So that, for example, if the UK has a special relationship with one country, France might have a special relationship with another country, they can coordinate on the diplomatic relationships that they have there to have a greater impact overall.
Thank you. Ambassador Guatemala, the Wagner Group have in effect kicked the French out of much of the Sahel. This clearly is of concern to the US. Can you help us with that?
I wish I could, sir, but honestly, the Wagner Group, now called the Africa Corps, is indeed riding roughshod over any notion of principled governance in West Africa, and it concerns me very much indeed that both Russia and China are really quite dominant in their influence in the region now. I did want to note, and sadly for me, I have to be very honest with you, I've been very sad and concerned at the way the current administration in Washington has dismembered our AID, our aid and assistance programs throughout the world, and especially in Africa, where treatment for AIDS, for example, has rapidly deteriorated due to the withdrawal of AID from Africa. So I will just post that personal concern of mine, which is very strongly felt. But I also took note last week of what I considered to be an important commentary in the Financial Times that NATO and the European Union working together should be in a position, and I'm not proposing that NATO take its military forces to Africa. The alliance has many partners in Africa, but in fact, that the two countries, two organizations, institutions working together should be focusing further on playing a global role in terms of assisting countries in Africa, and the European Union with its assistance budget able to perhaps step into the breach where some programs have been closed by the United States. So I do think that the institutions of Europe, both NATO and the European Union, should be also thinking in terms of the global role that they can play in countering Chinese and Russian dominance in the global South and particularly in Africa. So it takes us back to our previous discussion, but I think UK cooperation with the EU could be a force multiplier in this regard.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. With that, that concludes our first session. May I thank both our witnesses, Ambassador Gottemuller and Dr. Messmer, for some fascinating, very rich testimony. If there's anything further you wanted to provide the committee with in writing, we would welcome that. But with that, can I close our first session and we'll take a short break before moving to the second. Order. Order. Welcome back to today's meeting of the Joint Committee's scrutiny of Pillar 2 of the National Security Strategy. We're joined by Will Todman and Ambassador Mukherjee. Can I ask you both just to introduce yourselves briefly, perhaps starting with you, Ambassador?
Well, thank you for inviting me to this committee session. I was India's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations. Prior to that, I served in London as the Deputy High Commissioner. I was in the Russian Federation as the Deputy Chief of Mission. And I have also served in Central Asia and in the United Arab Emirates and in the World Trade Organization as a trade negotiator. Currently, I am a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation think tank in New Delhi, and I am on the faculty of a non-profit organization called Diplo Foundation, which focuses on capacity building young professional diplomats. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for joining us today. Mr. Todman.
Thank you so much for inviting me today. So my name is Will Todman. I'm the Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department, and also a Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, a bit of a mouthful. CSIS is an independent and non-partisan think tank in Washington, DC, and I should say that everything I say today is just my opinion. Most of my work in the Middle East has focused on the drivers of instability in the region, conflict-affected states, and also challenges of governance.
Thank you very much. Well, allow me, if I may, to kick off. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Todman, if I may. There's a bit of a fashion in some parts of the administration for suggesting that the Europeans should focus on the Euro-Atlantic, America's Pacific allies should focus on the Indo-Pacific. The two shouldn't really mix. And yet in our national security strategy, we talk about codependence, interconnectedness, and so on. Could you give us your perspective on that, please?
Yes, absolutely. I think the national security strategy is absolutely right when it talks about these different theaters being connected. Firstly, even within the Middle East as a region has been shown to be deeply interconnected over the last 2 years. Following the attacks of October the 7th, Israel has conducted attacks on either 6 or 7 countries across the region. Of course, the US joined with that in Iran. The Houthis have been attacking shipping lanes. And so because of that, I think the consequences of what happens in the Middle East have necessarily rippled into other theaters, and it becomes very difficult to separate the two. So the attacks on the shipping lanes have affected global commercial interests, supply chains, energy flows. Of course, that has affected the UK. We've seen the instability in the Middle East fueling waves of irregular migration. I know this is something that has roiled politics across Europe as well as in the US. And then I think also it's the connections play out in some interesting ways as well. Take Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The fact that Russia focused more of its forces on Ukraine created or contributed to the openings that the Syrian rebels identified last December when they launched this offensive against the Assad regime that ultimately toppled it in a matter of days. And then as well as that, we now see with Ukraine, Iran supplying weapons to support Russia's efforts, both missiles and drones. And some of my colleagues at CSIS have been doing work on this so-called CRINC axis, a sort of horrible acronym, but China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And I think although our determination is that this doesn't truly represent an axis yet, the bilateral, deepening bilateral ties between these 4 partners have real security consequences for the US, for European security more broadly. And I'm very happy to talk more about that if that's of interest.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Mukherjee, you've served in most of these regions, so your perspective on this question of disaggregation versus interconnectedness.
Well, when I read the National Security Strategy document, I was a bit puzzled by the connection between the transatlantic and the Indo-Pacific. I think the Indo-Pacific has been driven since 2017 by a set of drivers, primarily by the United States, and a very little footprint in that of transatlantic character. Today, the Indo-Pacific is in a bit of a disarray because of the current US administration's approach, which is not yet clear. But I think that in this period, we have seen a kind of a growth of identity of the Indo-Pacific among the states in what is defined as the Indo-Pacific region. And one problem that arises with the Indo-Pacific strategic framework is the lack of a common definition among the four countries driving the Indo-Pacific through the Quad. While the United States and Australia define the Indo-Pacific from the southern tip of India to the Pacific, Japan and India see it as a confluence of the entire Indian and Pacific Oceans. And I think that that's important in the context of what was just said by my co-panelist, because events in West Asia, events in the Gulf, unfortunately do not feature on the radar screen of the Indo-Pacific. And that is perhaps something that needs to be looked at.
Thank you both very much. Lord Boating.
That's very helpful, Ambassador Mukherjee, because I wanted to ask you about events in the Gulf and indeed in the Horn of Africa and further down south, because the Strategic Defence Review identifies the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific as secondary priority regions for UK defence after the Euro-Atlantic. India is a member of BRICS. India clearly has an interest in the Horn of Africa. China has a base in Djibouti. Russia is engaged in joint military naval exercises with South Africa off Simonstown, a traditional British base in the southern tip of Africa. What's your take on the extent to which the UK's national security strategy actually gets these priorities right? And what's your take about how our strategic interests are challenged by some of these recent developments?
Well, I think that's a very important point that you've raised, sir. I think that in terms of the UK's approach, the Indo-Pacific is a latecomer in terms of the diplomacy that has gone on in the past 20 years. The UK, of course, has to prioritize its own resources and its policies. But I would think that the first step should be to revisit 1971, because that's when the United Kingdom really left Asia and retreated into Europe. And today, for the United Kingdom to come back into Asia, it's a new Asia. It's a new dynamic on the ground here. And I think that requires much more interaction with the states that make up the Indo-Pacific or the Western Indo-Pacific region. The second thing that I think is important is the contribution of the states of this region to collective security or to the securing the Indo-Pacific region, which primarily has meant the maritime domain. There is very little on the landmass of the Indo-Pacific. It's primarily the maritime domain. And here, I think, as far as India is concerned, we have set out in 2015 a framework for the Indian Ocean called Security and Growth for All in the Region, or SAGAR. And I think that the United Kingdom would do well to see which parts of this framework strategy for the Indian Ocean proposed by India and worked on by several other Indian Ocean countries will fit into the UK's priorities and purposes. What the UK has going for it, even today, is a tremendous historical experience of this region. And whether it's Aden, where the British and the Indian armed forces set up the first base after the Suez Canal was opened, or to more recent times, the Diego Garcia, Mauritius, India, UK collaboration. I think there's a lot of history, but that needs to be now imaginatively brought into the strategic and diplomatic initiatives taken by the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Mr. Todderman.
Yes, I think I clearly agree that the Atlantic would be the primary theater, followed by the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific as secondary. I think my issue with the national security strategy is I don't believe it really is honest about the trade-offs that the government is making in the Middle East and the ways in which they really are undermining UK interest in the region. As Ambassador Gottmuller said in the previous session, cutting foreign aid is having real effects. And I'd say that this is also happening at a time of unparalleled opportunity in the Levant. We've got the potential to secure the sidelining of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the potential to help Syria ensure that it has a positive transition. And at the same time, the UK is reducing its military presence in the Gulf. The HMS Lancaster is due to be decommissioned, which would be its last permanent warship in the region. And my understanding is that it won't immediately be replaced. And so I think these are sending messages. These moves are sending messages about the prioritization. And although the national security strategy talks about the different tools that the UK has in the Middle East, diplomatic, humanitarian, military, and prosperity, it doesn't say which ones are most effective in this new environment. I personally believe that there is a real opening for diplomacy at the moment. In many ways, the military tools that Israel has wielded have done their job. They have sidelined Hezbollah. They helped or contributed to the overthrow of Assad, weakened Iran, clearly forced Hamas to agree to this ceasefire. And I think the UK is well placed to capitalize on the strategic connectivity that it has. It can talk to nearly everyone. It is trusted by the US, by Europe, by key regional players, and it's more agile as a mediator than most. It is difficult to do that when there are changes in our senior diplomats, and my hope is that the new foreign secretary will be in place for a while to be able to maximize on that potential. But I do think I would have liked to have seen more of a prioritization of the tools that the UK has to offer in the Middle East.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As you probably both can hear, a bell has just gone for a vote in the House of Lords, so we'll have to suspend the session there. I hope you will be able to stay on a little longer than perhaps we'd originally scheduled, and we'll return to the session as soon as we possibly can. We'll suspend the session there. Order. Welcome back to today's hearing of the Joint Committee on National Security, interrupted by votes. I'm going to move straight to Tandesi, the Chair of the Commons Defence Committee.
Thank you very much, Chair. Now, I think both of our panellists will be aware that the UK Strategic Defence Review and the National Security Strategy identify the changing nuclear context within the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East. Now, I've got a two-part question. I'll start with your good self, Ambassador Mukherjee. Firstly, how is this playing within your region of expertise? And secondly, if I might focus in on India-Pakistan tensions. Now, the National Security Strategy notes that, and I quote, tensions between India and Pakistan have reached their highest level for decades. And then it goes on to say that they would have a profoundly negative impact on our energy security, the cost of living, and our ability to grow our economy. So given this growing concern and the possibility of a further conflict or tension between India and Pakistan, what role do you think, if any, the UK can play to help de-escalate tensions? Ambassador?
Well, I think that, if I may, the best role that the UK can play, and I think it's playing already on the ground, is to be a source of support for the efforts of both sides to retain the nuclear option as the last option. I mean, there is a problem of no bilateral dialogue between India and Pakistan. That is acknowledged. But there is ongoing contact between the military establishment of Pakistan and the military establishment of India. And despite the sort of the stoppage of this bilateral dialogue, every year the nuclear installations agreement is implemented on the 1st of January, and both countries exchange their official sort of statuses of the nuclear establishment, and that happened even this year in January. So I think that it is a role that needs to be played very carefully, because the core issue, and going to your second question, is about the India-Pakistan relationship itself. Now, till earlier this year, there was understanding on continuing with efforts to sort out issues through good offices or bilaterally, but not through a third party. And that is something that I think is a red line as far as India is concerned. So it goes back to the treaty. It goes back to the Simla Agreement. It's a legal treaty. There's a legal provision in that. It's notified to the United Nations and so on. So for us to, in India, to sort of revisit that and try and get others involved would mean revisiting what happened in 1971, and that which was the context of the 1972 Simla Agreement. I think that is a realization, but when I say it, I also know that today, after 50 years, what happened in 1971 is also happening in bits and pieces again in South Asia. So we need to be very careful about what is going on.
Brilliant, thank you. Mr. Todman, if I can move to yourself with regards to the changing nuclear context, if you can please advise us about how do you think it's playing out in your region of expertise, and also the second part would be around Iran. So you will be aware that the UK Strategic Defence Review identified the risk of Iran's nuclear program. What role do you think that the Gulf states see the UK playing in containing Iran's future nuclear ambitions?
Order. Mr. Todman, we're just going to have to pause again there, as you've heard. Order. Welcome back. Resuming the Joint Committee session on the National Security Strategy. And Mr. Desi had just put a question to Mr. Todman about the Iranian nuclear program.
So I think, just going back 4 months, clearly Israel determined that there was a real risk of nuclear proliferation and Iran gaining nuclear weapons capabilities. I think 4 months on, those questions have not yet been resolved. Although intelligence reports have said different things, there are some senior members of the Iranian regime who have said that this has hardened their resolve to gain those capabilities. Just last week, Ali Shamkhani, one of the senior advisors to the Supreme Leader, essentially said as much and said that Israel's war in June would not have happened if they had had nuclear capabilities. And that would then lead to a knock-on effect with Saudi Arabia almost certainly seeking its own capabilities if it got to that stage. Now, I don't think that's very likely, though. And I do think that now there is a window of opportunity to try to consolidate some of those gains from the military tools that were used with diplomacy. The problem is that with the E3 just reimposing sanctions on Iran, trust is very, very low. But I do think that the UK still has a better ability to help get us back towards negotiations on the future of Iran's nuclear file than many other international actors. And you asked me about the Gulf states as well. And I think it's quite remarkable just how much Gulf states views and calculations on Iran have changed over the last decade. They went from vehemently opposing the Iran deal, the JCPOA, to now being very supportive of US-Iran talks in Oman and Italy. And so I think the Arab Gulf states would really be looking for the UK to try to advance diplomacy. Even though they consider Iran to be at a point of historic weakness, I think they still want some kind of agreement with Iran that can serve as a strategic framework for a more sustainable presence and relationship with Iran in the region. And I do think Gulf states are looking to the UK and others to get back towards diplomacy because they really fear what happens if Israel strikes again. Even if the US were to strike again, they think that the blowback will hit them once again.
Right, thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Sir Gavin.
Oh, thank you ever so much. For many decades, India has pursued a strategy of strategic autonomy. And obviously, the relationship between China and Russia has shifted significantly. I just wonder how you would describe Ambassador Mukherjee as to how you describe India's evolving relationship with Russia and China, and whether it's going to be realistic to continue to pursue strategic autonomy.
Thank you for that question. I think that events in the last 6 to 8 months in the Indo-Pacific region demonstrate the necessity for pursuing strategic autonomy as far as India is concerned, basically because the strategic investment that India made in developing a very close strategic partnership with the United States since 2017, including the signing of 4 foundational military cooperation agreements, seems to have now been forgotten in Washington, D.C., where trade and tariffs and issues which really should have been addressed through treaty and agreement frameworks are being addressed through the public media and social media. So the lesson that has been drawn in the last 6-7 months in India is to reinvest in the strategic autonomy, to reach out to China. Our Prime Minister went for the Shanghai Cooperation Summit a few weeks ago, and to reopen the contacts between India and China, which had been almost frozen for the last 5 years following the border clashes in Ladakh. As far as Russia is concerned, the relationship is more of a partnership than an alliance. The partnership is used for giving India what it needs in the case of, for example, defense. Now, in India, there is an awareness that this partnership gave India the equipment which it needed to counter the Pakistani army in the recent skirmish in May. So there is a kind of transactionalism at work behind strategic autonomy, which does not mean that India wants to be in a binary mode of either being with one or against the other. I think it also enables India strategic autonomy to create its own constituency of what is called by the media as the global south. And I think that's something that's now building up steam. And I think in the next couple of years, we'd see more of India as a third or a fourth option in a multipolar world.
Just as a sort of a, where would you see, Mr. Ambassador, as to where are some of the opportunities where the UK and India can work closer together? And is it possible to have a sort of genuine strategic partnership, or are these just nice diplomatic words to make a piece of paper feel a bit more special?
No, I think your question is very important, and I think the document that we have been discussing today actually identifies that area, which is the technology and security area. I have myself participated in the first cybersecurity connections between India and the UK way back in 2011. That has given fruit and has enabled a certain amount of trust to develop bilaterally between India and the United Kingdom. Well, what has bolstered it is the participation of private sector companies and entities in this technology and security partnership. And so today, when you see the 7 big pillars of the India-UK technology and security partnership, you see a whole of society participation rather than something that is led by diplomats and states. I mean, it's much more than that. And I think that that's the future that will drive the relationship forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lord Hutton.
Yes, I think this is probably a question largely for you, Mr. Todman. And I want to return briefly to having a look at the security environment in the Gulf. Since the UK National Security Strategy was published in June, there have obviously been some pretty significant developments in the Middle East, including, for example, the US-Israeli airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites, and hopefully the prospect of an emerging peace plan with Israel and Hamas. What do these events tell us about the security dynamics in the region now, do you think?
I think the way that a lot of actors in the Middle East see the events of the last few months is that this is a region without guardrails. So although many of the consequences of the actions you mentioned are actually in the UK's interest as it relates to weakening Iran, reducing the threat of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, and then hopefully coming to a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza. I think lots of Gulf states really view Israel now as a regional, or emerging as a regional hegemon. And they're really looking for signs that other international actors, namely the United States, can constrain it. Of course, this was most clearly seen by the Israeli attacks on Doha last month. And I think actually there are some promising signs in that regard. These are not the same, Gulf states that we have seen even a decade ago. They're now much more pragmatic, willing to come to agreements that will, secure their stability, economic stability in the region. And so I do think the threat environment is changing, but the longer term challenges, even the short term challenges, frankly, as it relates to Gaza, are huge. And I really hope that the UK will remain deeply engaged. I know that US officials pulled out the role of the UK in helping secure that ceasefire. And clearly, by talk of having Tony Blair playing a big role, they clearly trust UK diplomats to play an important role here. And I hope that that engagement remains strong so that we can try to work through the very, very challenging issues that are ahead. I do also think, though, that as Iran becomes more weakened in terms of its conventional capabilities, we will see an uptick in the kinds of cyber and hybrid threats that it conducts. Iran and other actors are increasingly using cyber tools for espionage, disinformation, attacking infrastructure. And so I hope that that will be a key part of the UK's defense strategy going forward. And again, that's why, getting back to the answer to the previous question, I do hope that the UK begins to rebuild trust with Iran and engages in diplomacy in a way that could consolidate these wins and get to a more sustainable balance of power and solutions for the region.
Do any of these changing security dynamics, in your view, mean that we should revisit the national security strategy and the way it's categorized UK security interests in the Gulf as being secondary?
No, I think that it should still, I think the region should still come as a secondary priority after Europe and the Atlantic. But I hope that being a second priority doesn't mean that the region is really sidelined and really comes very far down the list when it comes to the allocation of resources. And some of the moves that we have seen, as I mentioned earlier, the cuts to aid, the withdrawal of the HMS Lancaster, they do signal a declining UK interest in the region. And I think that that's a mistake. And so there are some lower cost ways of signaling that the UK still really cares about this region. And I think part of what I would hope the UK would be doing is building on some of the structures that already exist, security structures in the region, that they can take them from being bilateral to multilateral. We saw this as it relates to Bahrain with the CCPA. This is the comprehensive security, integration, and prosperity agreement that was originally between Bahrain and the United States. The UK became a formal member of it earlier this summer. And I think that is a really important signal to bolstering collective security and some new kinds of security architectures that can better meet the needs of this changing environment. And ultimately, we did already see the positive benefits of that. Bahrain was the only Arab state to engage in the maritime mission that the UK participated in the Red Sea to counter the Houthis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, Lord Robotham.
Very briefly, because I understand we're pressed for time. Could we turn briefly to Saudi Arabia? I think particularly this, Mr. Todman, this is your department. We have a long history of a good relationship with Saudi Arabia. Al Yamana, which must go back 40-odd years now, and a lot of defence agreements. However, things seem to be changing there, and in particular, Saudi Arabia's evolving relationship with China. So could you tell me what your take on what is happening in Saudi Arabia is, if you've got one?
Yes, I think Saudi Arabia sees itself as a middle power, and it is forging strategic partnerships with a wide variety of states across the world. China is an important strategic partner for Saudi Arabia. It is the biggest importer of oil, but I think focusing too much on that downplays some of the other ways in which China plays a deep economic role in Saudi Arabia. If you take renewable energies, China is investing upstream, downstream in the development of renewable technologies in Saudi Arabia, which the Saudi government has described as a key pillar of its economic strategy going forward. And so it's going to be very, very difficult, I think, to dislodge that going forward. So I think when the UK does have a partnership with Saudi Arabia, it needs to be in the understanding that it has less leverage over Saudi Arabia, because ultimately the Saudis have other options. And so I think then it's incumbent on the UK and like-minded allies, particularly in the West, to articulate why the value add of deepening engagement with the West is preferable to that of China. And it's not too late for that. I think although China has made serious advances when it comes to technology partnerships, we see that the Saudis are still looking for other partners. I think if there is this free trade agreement between the UK and the GCC, that will spark a lot of deeper technology partnerships between the UK and Saudi Arabia. And so I think there are still options, but all of the relationship going forward needs to be understood as just one piece of Saudi strategy. And I think the time of the UK and frankly, even the US being able to dictate the terms of those partnerships are probably over because it does have so many other options.
Thank you very much. Clear echoes there of the earlier point that Ambassador Mukherjee made about strategic autonomy and India, and some themes emerging there. Thank you both very much for a fascinating session. Thank you both for your patience with the disruption to it because of the votes here. That concludes today's session. Thank you to Mr. Todman, Ambassador Mukherjee, and to our earlier witnesses for joining us today. That concludes today's session. Order.